very, very warm welcome to you all, to all of those of you here in the room and to all of the people joining us online. We're really delighted to welcome you here to the Nuffield Foundation today and to be hosting this event to give us all the opportunity to hear results from 3 Nuffield Foundation funded research projects about school absence, school closure and learning loss. And they are really very, very new. One of them's recently published, 2 are not yet published in full. So you're really hearing it hot off the press. And to be able to discuss these findings with an expert panel and with you, the audience, about what actions should be considered by the incoming government, by school leaders, and by the wider education sector to improve learning outcomes for young people. And we're really pleased that today we've got people joining us from right across the UK and indeed beyond. So we've really got an opportunity to think about the implications across the whole of the UK today. Of course, we didn't actually plan this event to fall 2 days before the general election, but it has, and that's fine. And we decided that we would certainly go ahead because now is a really opportune moment as the academic year has either recently finished in Scotland and Northern Ireland or is soon to finish in England and Wales. And to really take stock, we've had latest data on attendance figures showing how absence remains stubbornly high for this academic year, and to take stock at the end of an academic year that has seen a flurry of initiatives following the Education Select Committee report and the government response to that. And whatever the outcome of the election, this topic will need to be high on the agenda of an incoming government, and we'll be capturing the discussion today and sharing it again over the summer and at the start of the next academic year to make sure that those messages are really heard. So I'm just going to say a few words by way of format. I should have introduced myself at the start. I'm Emily Tanner. I'm Programme Head here at the Nuffield Foundation for Post-14 Education and Skills. And I'm going to be chairing the first part of our event today, when we're going to hear from 4 presenters on 3 research grants. And we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of each of those presentations. And so please to gather up your questions as we go. For the online audience, please post your questions. And one thing just to bear in mind is we're going to try and keep the questions during this first session to the detail of the research that we're going to hear about, and any reflections or questions or thoughts you have about wider policy and practice implications, save those up and we'll get to that at the panel session. So in between the second and the third presentations, we're going to have a short comfort break just to stretch your legs. The bathrooms are up here and downstairs. Feel free to use both and both doors, and just to give our online audience a bit of a breather. And then we'll have networking and drinks for those in the room at 4:45 at the end of the event. So I hope that's all clear. I will introduce all the speakers briefly, but you can find fuller biographies of everyone speaking this afternoon on the event page. So please do look there. And you'll also find from there links through to each of the research projects. So do feel free to use those links. We're really pleased to be joined by Matilda Martin from TES. Thank you for joining us. And we may have some other journalists online as well. You're very welcome. We're really pleased to have you here. And in terms of practicalities, we're not expecting a fire alarm. So if you hear a fire alarm, feel free to use both doors to exit this room. There are doors and stairs either side of the lifts, and there are various staff around with events badges who will guide you and direct you out. And then just to let you know, the meeting is being recorded today and will be made available online afterwards, along with the slides. So you don't need to feel like you need to scribble everything. And we'll be taking photographs from the back of the room, so backs of heads, and then photographs of speakers. If you've got any issue with that, do come and let one of us know. So I think that's all from me. I'm really delighted to be handing first to Marcus Klein and Edward Sozu, who from Strathclyde University, who are going to share their research on school attendance, education and labour market outcomes. So over to you, Marcus.
Thank you very much. We are very pleased to present findings from our project, Understanding School Attendance, Education and Labour Market Outcomes. The presentation is based on joint work with our previous research associate, Jascha Draeger, and our current research associates, Olga Rota and Valentina Perinetti-Casoni, who are all here. Yeah. We believe that our project on the consequences of school absences is quite timely, given recent trends in absence rates after the pandemic. So in this figure, you can see the overall absence rate in black and the persistent absentee rate in green in state schools in England from 2006 and 2007 until the previous academic year. You can see that actually the both rates were declining before the pandemic and then sharply increasing after the pandemic. So in the last school year, 1 out of 4 students has been persistently absent in this particular year. So that's quite what we call a school attendance crisis. And this crisis has also been heavily featured in the media. You can see stories from the New York Times and the BBC on the left-hand side. And there has also been a recent inquiry last year from the Education Committee on persistent absence and support for disadvantaged pupils, and they've provided recommendations on how to reduce barriers on school attendance. The Department of Education has also introduced new initiatives to tackle school absenteeism, including the expansion of the Attendance Hubs program and also introducing attendance mentors in areas across the country with the highest absence rates. So this is clearly, school attendance is clearly a top priority in policy. We know that absences are harmful to attainment, but this research is mostly from the US context and also has some limitations that we would like to address. So we had 4 research aims in our research. We wanted to look at the long-term effects of pupil absences on educational attainment and labour market outcomes in mid-adulthood. We also wanted to investigate more the absence dynamics. So absences are not static. So here we look at the timing of absences during children's schooling and also trajectories of absences and whether they have consequences for attainment, also taking the reason for absence into account. In the third part, we looked at why absences are harmful to achievement. And here we consider the role of psychosocial factors like problem behaviors and educational motivation. And in the last part, we were interested in impact heterogeneity. So we considered to what extent the impact of absences on attainment varies across socio-demographic groups. And here we looked, for instance, at family socioeconomic background, but also children with special educational needs and disabilities. To investigate the long-term impact of absences on educational and labour market outcomes, we used the British cohort study 1970, which is a birth cohort study of children born in 1970 in Great Britain, and which has been followed up until age 46. To investigate the dynamics, mechanisms, and impact heterogeneity, we rely on the Millennium Cohort Study and linked national pupil days data from England, which includes attendance information from year 1 to year 11, and also achievement data from KS1, KS2, and KS4. We also use Welsh data, the Welsh MCS sample linked to Welsh administrative school data, and we replicate the analysis that we have done for England with these Welsh data. Okay, we argue that absences disrupt the skill formation process, so initial learning losses may accumulate over time and result in skill deficiencies, which then makes it harder for children to catch up longer term. So it might be the case that children who are frequently absent basically lack the skills needed to succeed in education and labor market, in the labor market long term. So using the British cohort study in 1970, we looked at the association between absences at age 10 and educational attainment at age 42. And you can see in this figure that if we look at different qualifications, we don't see an impact of absences on any of these qualifications. However, we see an impact of absences on having no qualifications. So missing 5 days at school at age 10 is associated with a 0.66 percentage point increased likelihood of having no qualifications at age 42, controlling for a lot of other measurements like early cognitive ability, behavior, and socio-demographic characteristics. We also looked at whether absences impact labor market outcomes, and here we looked at employment and occupational destinations. Again, we see that absences do not increase or decrease the likelihood of entering professional managerial occupations or being in the working class, but it has an impact on being out of the labor force. So it increases the likelihood of not participating in the labor force, either being inactive or unemployed. So missing 5 days of school at age 10 is associated with a 0.6 percentage point increase in the likelihood of being predominantly out of the labor force between the ages of 30 and 42. The impact of absences on attainment may depend on the timing of absences during schooling. So on the one hand, we can argue that early absences are more harmful to attainment because children miss out on foundational learning, which is then negative for learning more advanced skills. So missing out on these foundational learning is crucial. On the other hand, we could argue that later absence is more harmful because children miss out on recent exposure to examined content, which is important for the final exams. Yeah? An alternative theory suggests that absences are more harmful during the school transition because children have, during this transition have a lot of changes in friendships, teachers, pedagogical approaches, and missing out on this transition period is particularly harmful to their attainment later on. In addition to timing, we also take the trajectories of children in terms of absence into account because they provide a more holistic approach to long-term consequences during the whole schooling period and also take the cumulative impact of absence into account. We also need to say that all these dynamics are intertwined with the reason for absences, as we know that unauthorized absences become more prevalent over time. So we also take the reason into account when we look at these dynamic aspects. Right, coming to the results. So in this figure, you can see the year-specific effects of absences on the likelihood of attaining 5 or more GCSEs and also the attainment aid score. For total absences in black, authorized absences in blue, and unauthorized absences in red. And what you can see if we focus first on the total absences, that absences are harmful in every year on attainment. But what you can also see is that absences in year 6 to 10 are more harmful than previous absences. Yeah? And we can also see this when we look at authorized absences. So these patterns are mirrored when looking at authorized absences. For unauthorized absences, there seems to be a more persistent impact of absences on attainment in every year, suggesting that also the earlier absences are equally harmful. But when we test the difference between unauthorized and authorized absence for every year, we do not find statistically significant differences. So these unauthorized and authorized absence seem to be equally detrimental to attainment. Now, when it comes to trajectories over time, we found 5 typical absence trajectories. So most children, so 2/3 of our sample, have consistently low absences, right? So this is this figure. Then we have more than 1/4 of our sample who have consistently moderate authorized absences. Yeah? And then we have 3 smaller groups, moderately increasing unauthorized absences, strongly increasing authorized absences, and strongly increasing unauthorized absences. So this is quite a sharp decrease, but it's only less than 1% of our sample. And then we can see whether these absence trajectories are associated with attainment, controlling for a lot of factors and also previous absences. And what you can see is that, for instance, the consistently moderate authorized absences has a detrimental impact to attainment. So if you look at 5 or more GCSEs, in this group, they are 8 percentage points less likely to attain 5 or more GCSEs. If you look at the 3 increasing absence groups, these are here, you see that they have a massively negative impact on attainment. Yeah? With the strongly increasing unauthorized absence group with the most severe impact on attainment. Okay, I think Edward will continue. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Marcus. So Marcus has talked about the impact of absences on achievement. And what we wanted to do here at the next stage is to look at the reasons for these differences. So overall, much of the assumption is that the reasons why absence is detrimental is due to learning loss. That means children are not in school and they are not learning, and that is why they are doing poorly in their exams. But there is another alternative hypothesis, because absences can adversely affect psychosocial outcomes. So, for example, there is evidence that if children are not in school, they might be engaging in risky behaviors as a result of not being within the school context. The other aspect is that not being in school means that children are not able to acquire those skills and those psychosocial skills that are quite necessary for doing well at school. So an example is a decline in educational motivation or not being able to develop those pro-social behaviors. And there is evidence that these psychosocial factors are also linked to achievement. But very few studies have looked at the extent to which these explain the association between absences and achievement. So that is what we wanted to investigate in the next stage. So we look at absences at age 12, and we look at these psychosocial factors at age 14, and we look at achievement at age 16. The reason for doing that is to control for previous measures of these psychosocial factors, because they are also predictors of absences, and also previous measures of attainment. And what we found basically is that the key psychosocial factors are externalizing behavior. We find risky behaviors and educational motivation to explain the association between being absent at school and subsequent educational achievement. For self-esteem, we find that absences reduce self-esteem, but self-esteem is not associated with achievement in this particular model. And we replicate these same findings for Wales as well. The other aspect was to look at whether the association between being absent at school and educational achievement varies across children's socio-demographic characteristics. And here the assumption is that if you come from more advantageous family background, you might have the resources to be able to counter the effect of absences. But what we find from our study is that absences are detrimental to achievement irrespective of socioeconomic context. So we do not find any evidence of this double disadvantage. So absences are detrimental irrespective of whether you come from a high or low socioeconomic context. So that is a very important point to emphasize. Okay, so we've talked about all these findings, and the key question is, what are some of the implications from these findings? The first is to look at the long-term impact. As Marcus has demonstrated, we find that absences at age 10 have a longer-term impact at age 42 in terms of being out of the labor market or not obtaining any education. So this means that there is a need for targeted attendance intervention and to address the underlying consequences, underlying causes of absence in order to reduce any inequalities, both in education as well as in the labor market. So this is quite an important implication. The second aspect is that school policies need to prioritize helping children to recover learning loss when they miss school, because this is quite important, because when they miss school, they miss out on educational achievement, and having the component of learning will be a key part of interventions. The third aspect is that we are proposing that there's an opportunity for lifelong learning, so that those who are chronically absent from school are able to develop the skills needed to succeed in the labor market, given the impact of not being of absences or not participating in the labor force. Now, in terms of the dynamics, the key implications are that policies and interventions need to address all forms and all levels of absences, and not just persistent absences, because we found that actually very low levels of absences over time are equally harmful. And also there needs to be an emphasis on both authorized as well as unauthorized absences, because we find those to be equally harmful. There is also a need for early identification of those who are at greater risk of absenteeism, and this will require schools and local authorities and analyzing absence data to determine the trends and to look at those who are potentially at risk and being able to help those young people overcome the challenges that are leading to absences within a school context. But that will also require data sharing, because, for example, when we look at those transition periods, there might be a need for data sharing between primary as well as secondary transition stages to look at those who might potentially be at risk. And then finally, in terms of the dynamics, we think interventions need to reduce absences, and these are at all stages, because again, we find that absences are detrimental irrespective of the stage of education, but particular attention needs to be paid to that transition period where we find a much larger effect of absenteeism on achievement. And then the final part, which is around the psychosocial factors, I think our main recommendation here is that if children and young people are absent from school, and when they return to school, there need to be that emphasis on educational success. And that educational success can enable them to gain higher levels of motivation and educational motivation. And that is quite crucial to succeed. And then the second recommendation is that interventions that are aimed at addressing problem and risky behaviors will be quite useful, because risky behaviors are both a risk to absences, but are also explain the reasons why children might do poorly in exams. And then finally, given that absences are detrimental to everybody, irrespective of socio-demographic context, there needs to be an emphasis on absences across all groups and nationally. This can also reduce the stigmatizing effect that focusing on particular socio-demographic groups might bring about. So thanks very much. And we want to say a special thank you to the members of our research advisory group, some of whom are here, who provided us with a lot of support as well as guidance. And these are some of our outputs from our research. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Edward and Marcus, for getting through such a lot of fascinating content in such a quick time. I know it's not easy to squeeze a very long and detailed project into 20 minutes, so thank you very much. So time to take your questions now. We have some microphones that we're going to be passing around. Do please wait for a microphone, because then it means that people online can hear properly, as well as everyone in the room. If you could say your name and where you're from, and keep your question brief, that would be absolutely fantastic. So I think I'm going to start by taking a couple of questions from the room first, and then I'll hand to Ruth, who's going to bring in some of our online questions. So who would like to go first?
You take that.
Hello.
Hiya.
I'm Ellie Costello. I'm from Square Peg. I represent more than 60,000 families whose children struggle to attend, access or remain in education. And I'm a parent of lived experience as well, with 2 children who fell out of the system and became persistent absentees. So I have a lot of skin in the game for this one. My first question is, I think in terms of that upward spike, we know that post-COVID, there was a cultural shift in the way that absences were authorised, and that schools actually felt that they could no longer authorise. And so my first question is, to what extent has that been factored in? And secondly, is a 0.66% increase statistically significant? I'm not sure it is, but I'm glad that this conversation is being had. My second question, follow up, I suppose, is, are we really all thinking and stretching around the education system itself and whether or not it's serving our families and our children appropriately? I know that there's a lot of excellent people within that system who are trying to do that, but I think our children are holding a mirror up to us, and we need to really listen. The pressure that families feel at the moment is that they're not allowed to fall behind, because all of it is about lost learning and not about their well-being, their welfare, whether or not they're in safe housing, whether or not they can afford transport, etc. And the other message that our children are getting is that if they miss one day off school, their life chances are over, and that is massively impacting their mental health. So I suppose my question is, in terms of the recommendations, in terms of universal approaches, I think is absolutely brilliant, because actually targeted approaches lead to families feeling targeted, some more than others. But if all we are focusing on is lost learning and getting children a bum on a seat in a classroom, I think that's a real risk, because actually our children feel that they don't matter, and that all it is whether or not they can swallow the facts to pass the test. So again, in terms of a policy recommendation, then what does that look like? Finally, on risky behaviours, if all we're looking at is crime, there's a whole range of risky behaviours. That could include self-harm, risks to running away, unsafe relationships, etc. But whilst we're focusing on street crime and violent crime, there are untold numbers who are ending up at risk of CAMS and Tier 4. And actually, I suppose it's about ensuring that conversation is wider in terms of our understanding of lost learning. So I guess going back to my first question is just, how are you factoring in that cultural shift post-COVID in the way that the system was authorising or unauthorising absences?
Thank you. That was a very full question. Thank you. Some of the points that you've raised there, I think I saw you nodding, Anna, I think we'll come back to in the panel. So perhaps specifically on some of those points to answer, since there was such a lot there, and then we'll go to the next question.
Regarding our findings, it's fair to say that they are pre-COVID, so they're not relating to post-COVID, because the MCS, age 16 is 2016 measured attainment, so everything is before COVID. We can relate to the post-COVID period, but of course, patterns may have changed after COVID. Regarding the effect on labor market outcomes and educational attainment, the effect is statistically significant. Of course, you can argue, is it a meaningful effect, right? Just because something is statistically significant doesn't make it meaningful. But you have to understand that these are limited data we had to use. It is a measurement at age 10 in spring term, so it's just one term. And therefore, we would argue it's remarkable that absences in just one term at age 10 has such a long-term impact on outcomes, even though the number doesn't sound that impressive. So I think it's fair to say, if we had more measures of absences over time for children from the 1970 cohort and cumulative impact of absences, the effects would be much larger, probably, but we cannot say that for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to take another question, Edward, and this, you had a question.
Thank you very much. Celia Hoyles, UCL Institute of Education. Mine's a really simple question compared with the previous one. For your measure of attainment, you just amalgamate all your 5 GCSEs. And I'm from mathematics education, and I wondered whether there's any differential impact across different subjects, because I think in the past, I can't recall, cite to you the references, there has been quite a big difference.
So we had limited time, so we looked at 5 or more GCSEs, an attainment 8 measure, but we also looked at math and English, and we found exactly the same pattern. Yeah. So just because of time restrictions, we could only present some of our results.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to Ruth now, who's monitoring the questions coming in from our online audience. Ruth, what's coming through?
So just make sure the mic's working. There was a question here about whether you could describe some of the expected challenges for children with special educational needs, and whether you've looked at that within your project.
Yeah. So I think overall, special educational needs, it's a key predictor of absences, and that's been shown generally. So those are challenges overall. But when we look at the impact of absences on whether or not children are identified with special educational needs or not, we find that the impact is equally harmful irrespective of the group in which they belong.
Is there anything else that you wanted to come in with, Ruth? No. Any more questions in the room? There's someone just further back, the gentleman with the blue shirt.
Hi, my name's Joe. I'm from an organisation called MIME, and we work with local authorities a lot. And I was interested in the recommendation around spotting people on kind of problematic absence pathways, I guess, for early intervention. I think my question is about the slide where you sort of present those different pathways, and it's just about could you clarify sort of which are the most problematic of those pathways and what are they? So what are you looking out for if you're doing the early intervention?
Yeah, so we have, this is the consistently low absence trajectory. So there's no problem. Absences are low at any school stage. Then we have consistently moderate authorized absences. Yeah, these are more than 1/4 of our sample. So these are authorized absences, but at a moderate level throughout. Then we have moderately increasing unauthorized absence. That's the red line, right? So it's moderate. There's a moderate increase. Then we have strongly increasing authorized absence. That's the blue line, goes up. And we have strongly increasing unauthorized absences. Yeah. But in our MCS sample, these groups are very small. So this is 4%, 1.6%, and less than 1% of our sample, right? But it would be nice to replicate this analysis with the full national pupil database, because this is just the MCS sample, because we wanted to look at attainment and also controlling for other factors that are important and that we have in the MCS. So what you can see is that the strongly increasing unauthorized absence has the most harmful effect on achievement. But also the other groups, even the moderately authorized absences throughout, has a negative impact. Our argument is therefore, if we only look at persistent absenteeism or chronic absenteeism, we may miss out those that have always a moderate level. So they are also, these absences are important too. And in terms of early identification, because you have these trajectories of a rise in absences, it's important to catch them early and understand the underlying causes of absences to prevent this from happening, this increase. That's
one thing to say is that this is across the school life course, but you can also look at this using daily school data or monthly school data generally to try and map the trajectories, which will give you much more regular information to identify groups and to provide the support that is needed. Yeah.
Great, we've got time for just a couple more questions. Ruth, I'm just going to check, is there, can I come to you next?
Yeah, somebody was interested to know whether you were able to identify the predictors of your different absence trajectory groups or whether your sample sizes were too small.
That's always coming up as a question also in our knowledge exchange events in Cardiff and Manchester that we had. And it's a very important question, but we were focusing on the consequences here. But it is, I think we did some analysis and we found, of course, the predictors of these increasing trajectories are mostly coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Yeah. But we didn't do a proper analysis of the predictors, who is in these trajectory groups. That might be something we should consider in the future.
Thank you. Always good to know what's coming next. One last question in the room, this lady here.
Thank you. Maura Wallace. I used to work on absence in government and I am now a researcher looking at it at LSE. I don't know if this will have showed up in your data, but anecdotally, we know that a lot of young people who have high levels of absence are disproportionately likely to be off-rolled and to disappear from schools because they are a problem for the school and the threat of being fined is a problem for the parent. So I was wondering, did you find anybody who was an extra trajectory who disappeared and just didn't have a school to be absent from later on in the MCS data?
So I think for this particular data, we use complete data. So those with complete data. So it is highly likely that there is a group that has disappeared, and it is possible to model that. I think one of the things we've actually talked about is if you look at the entire MCS data set and NPD data, which is at a national level, and you try to model trajectories, it is likely that we might also find extra trajectories that are not captured here just because of the sample size. But particularly the question you've asked is important because those individuals may not be in the data set that we've used, and that may be a different trajectory altogether. So I think that's a very important point that you've raised here.
Great. Well, look, thank you for those excellent questions. I know lots to mull over there. And thank you, Marcus and Edward, for that really interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've heard about the long-term outcomes of absence. We're now going to hear from Professor Steve Gibbons from LSE about what was going on specifically during the COVID period when schools were closing. So over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present this research. As Emily's just said, it's kind of on the same broad issue as what we were just hearing, but it's kind of focusing on a more niche question, which is to do with, what was the impact of the pandemic on absence and what were the consequences for attainment. So it's looking at a more limited sort of number of years just recently. It's joint work with Sandra McNally, who's over there, and Piero, who I believe is online because I saw him there, Piero Montebruno. Oops. Oh no. There we go. Okay, so the topic, the influence of absence on attainment and the influence of absence on future attainment, trying to see what we can learn from what was going on in the pandemic on those questions. Okay, so whether it doesn't really need a lot of motivation, I guess, in terms of why absence is an important question. The thing we're thinking about here is, we know that the absence levels have gone up and attainment has gone down post-pandemic. That's a pretty well established set of facts. What we don't know is, what caused these changes. We don't know so much about that. Were they something to do with the pandemic in general? Was it to do with schools being closed? Was it to do with kids being sent home? Was it to do with the broader kind of social and economic restrictions that were in place, or something else? So our aim here is to try and shed some light on these questions using quantitative analysis of large-scale admin data, the NPD data that we were just hearing about there. We're using the micro-level data from the National Pupil Database to do a lot of this research. So I'll tell you up front what we find. Then you can switch off the rest of the presentation if you want. What we're coming up with here is that the local restrictions that, we're interested in knowing about the impacts of government policy on absences and subsequent attainment. Looking at national lockdowns isn't very useful because they affect everyone everywhere all at the same time, so they're not too useful. So what we're looking at here is if you cast your mind back to what was going on all those years ago, there was a period in autumn 2020 when these tier regulations were in place and imposing increasing levels of restrictions on the kind of economic and social activities of people, although at the time the schools were actually open in this period, right? So we're trying to use these, the kind of quasi-experimental shock that shifted attitudes to absence, and see what we can learn from the variation in absence across schools that were driven by these local tier restrictions, okay? We find that these tiers do actually impact on absence, and we find that there are very differential effects from students of different backgrounds, somewhat in line with what we were just hearing. Kids with from more disadvantaged backgrounds have higher level of absence and responded in a bigger way to these higher levels of tiers, these greater restrictions. We start to then look at the dynamics of absence in the sense of, what does a shock to absence now do for absence in the future? The kind of time decay of changes in absence, if you like. And we find that absenteeism during the pandemic and in general actually is very much linked to high levels of absence later on. There's a kind of decay of this over time, but it's quite persistent. All right. We then go to look at achievement, not long-term achievement, not sort of achievement in a long way in the future, but looking at Key Stage 2 and GCSEs just in the year following the pandemic period, right? And we do find that these local restrictions impacted on achievement. So the high level tiers, the kids in schools in the high level tiers had worse outcomes. And you could interpret that as working through absence rates, but as I'll show you at the end, the scale of the effect suggests that there's something bigger going on here, that these local restrictions were having broader impacts that have affected achievement later on, right? So our conjecture here is that the signals, or something to do with this restrictive government policy, changed attendance behaviour, changed other kind of behaviours that then impacted on subsequent achievement, right? So, you know, in a sense, perhaps well, there's quite a surprise, I think, to learn that these tiers had that kind of impact. But in general, I think the story that's being told here is in line with kind of what we know already. Yeah, okay. So there's two parts to this, and I won't talk much about the first one. We've got two papers, really, two sort of research projects within one. One is using DFE school level survey data, which is daily data that was conducted through the pandemic up to sort of mid-July 21. And we use that to see whether there were high levels of absence on the days that schools are in a particular tier restriction, right? So we've got some work on that, and we look at a whole range of things using those kind of data. The thing I'm going to focus on more here is this work using the National Pupil Database, which is looking at the absence outcomes for individual students, right? Not using this survey data. Importantly, I mean, this project is a bit beset by data issues because, you know, we went in hoping we were going to get information on school closure, hoping we were going to get information on student outcomes during the pandemic, none of which turned out to be available. So, you know, there's complete censoring of data during 2019, 2020, and yeah, so it's kind of, you know, we're struggling in terms of what we've got here, which very much defines the way that we've set up this research project and the kind of results we're generating. So I said I wasn't going to say much about this, but this DFE school level survey data, this is the kind of one result we've got from this, which illustrates the general point. This is the association between the different tiers that are in place during autumn 2020 and absence in percentage points in primary schools, right? So this is all relative to tier 1, which we're treating as the sort of minimal level of restrictions at the time. We need some sort of base rate. And when schools were in tier 2, they had absence rates that were 3 percentage points higher. Well, tier 3, pretty similar. These are coefficients basically here with little confidence intervals on them. And in tier 4, which is the strongest restrictions, it was up at about 5.5 percentage points higher. So these tiers were having impacts on absence rates. I mean, it's a bit silence about the mechanisms, but it was they seem to be impacting on absence rates in schools, right? And in other results that we've got in this work, we show that this interacts with levels of deprivation that the students come from, interacts with their free school meal level entitlement, the sort of urban status of the areas they come from. And all these things have amplified these effects. So the kids coming from more deprived backgrounds have bigger effects from these tiers on their attainment behaviour, right? That's the schools with more people from those kind of backgrounds had, you know, bigger impacts in terms of the effects of these tiers, right? Okay, so let's talk about this National Pupil Database work we're doing here, which we think is pretty interesting. This has all been sort of covered a little bit in the earlier presentation, what happened to absences. We've got two periods here we're looking at. We're using the sort of pre-pandemic period as a control period and the post or during pandemic period as an actual treatment thing we're looking at. So we rather than authorised and unauthorised, an important thing we're doing here is thinking about these what we call unforced and forced absences. So again, if you remember what was going on in the pandemic at this time, kids didn't go to school if they were in a support bubble or some other group that had an infection. They said they were sent, they couldn't come to school. So this is what we call a forced absence, and it's called codex in the database. So that's what the codex means. The unforced absence is everything else. You know, they weren't sent home, some other kind of absence. It's actually, before you tell me that the things don't add up over here, the unforced absence is defined as a share of what's left after the forced absence has happened. Right? And then we've got overall absence here. So pre-pandemic, it was about 3.5%. overall absence. Of course, all this was unforced in our definitions because Codex didn't exist. And the year before that, it was pretty similar, right? So this would be 2017-18. You come to post-pandemic, during pandemic, in 21-22, so autumn 21, we had overall absence rates about 9%, 7.7. The rate for unforced absence and forced absence is 1.7. If you go back to the height of the pandemic, autumn 2020, these figures much higher, right? But clearly it stayed up, and we know that it stayed up, and it stayed up much higher than it was pre-pandemic. Yeah. This is what we refer to as chronic absence, or so this is missing more than 10% of sessions, more than 20%, more than 40%. This has rocketed up from 8% pre-pandemic to 34% post-pandemic, missing more than 10%, missing more than 20% from 1.4% to 10%, going up almost a factor of 10, and missing more than 40%. So that's really missing 2 days a week, right? That's got that shot up from 0.2% to 2.3%. So again, up by a factor of 10. So these are just some descriptives to set the scene, right? Okay, we're going to look at the key thing is to understand about the tiers. If you can remember what was going on, there was a whole range of things in place. There was a period of tier regulations where you had tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Then there was a national lockdown for a month. And then there were a couple of weeks at the end of term when it went back into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So these are the interventions we're looking at. And there were also some local lockdowns that were in place at the same time. And so we're going to look at the impact of the number of days that students were in schools that were affected by these tiers, the impact that these have on absence, right? So this is basically it. So autumn 2020, this is the first sort of step in what we're doing, looking at the effect of these tiers on autumn 2020 absence. This picture has the absence rates on the y-axis, has the different tier groups along here, and the different bars are different levels of the deprivation index that's attached to these students in the NPD. So this is the IDACHI, income deprivation affecting children. What's the I? Anyway, so the blue is 10%, so that's relatively undeprived. 50% is seriously quite deprived, and 90% is like at the top end. So you can see that this is the tier 3 and tier 2 in the second part of term after the second national lockdown. Huge effects for the people in the most deprived areas, still quite big effects for the people in the less deprived areas. So this is telling us that one day in one of these tiers, it pushed up absence by 0.55 percentage points for the most deprived, right? Less going on for these other categories. There's these big impacts from tier 2 and tier 3 at the end of term. So what are we going to do with that now? We're going to try and understand from that how the shocks to absence caused by those tier regulations impacted on students after the pandemic had ended, right? So this picture, which I'll try and explain in 30 seconds, is kind of looking at this dynamics of how absence decays over time, and you get a shock to absence. What's the sort of half-life of it, if you like? To be upfront, we're only estimating two things here. We're estimating numbers at year 1 here, and we've got two curves, which I'll explain in a second. This is telling us that you get a shock to absence in year 1, next year it'll be about 60% of that value, right? And then these are all imputed based on that pattern repeating. So 0.6 times 0.6 is 0.36 and so on, right? And the way this is estimated is thinking about, for a given pupil, how does the absence shock between 2017 and 2020 affect the change in absence between 2018 and 2021, right? So it's looking at these changes, how the change in absence affects the change in absence the year later, right? To try and understand this dynamic process. This one here is if you just do that simple sort of analysis without thinking about the pandemic policies. This one is if you predict the absence from those tier regulations that I was just describing, right? You can see there are many reasons to think this is not going to be a good estimate. I won't go into the technicalities, but if you know about these kind of estimates, you will understand that it's kind of mean reversion issues mean this is going to be way too underestimated. This is kind of a more plausible estimate of this kind of time decay. So it tells us that actually, it is pretty persistent, right? Whatever happened in the pandemic is going to be last year it's going to fall down to 10% of what it was. It's going to take 5 years' time for that to erode, right? So it's a very gradual process of erosion of these shocks we're seeing here. We do a lot more with this. We look at it by phase. Really interesting thing here. It's all, well, a lot of it's on secondary schools. It's still something for primary schools, but these absence shocks are much less persistent in primary schools than secondary schools. It's worse for people, for students from FSM backgrounds. Most interestingly is this, I think, which is looking at this forced absence thing I was talking about earlier. So these are the unforced absences. So you've got this sort of slow decay of the shocks to these unforced absences caused by these tier regulations. These are the forced absences. So where kids were sent home because they were, you know, in a bubble that had an infection or something like that, or a household that had an infection. These are totally non-persistent. So actually, you know, the forced absences, the sending the kids home, actually, you know, it doesn't have any long-lasting impact. It's all to do with something to do with the change in attitudes to absence generated by these policies. If that kind of makes sense, right? So this might sort of, you know, this might speak to questions about whether or not sending kids home for training days has a sort of, you know, long-lasting impact or something like that, or whether strikes have a long-lasting impact. Possibly not. You know, it's something more to do with shifts in preferences and attitudes. We looked at also impact on chronic absence. Sorry, people getting up. There's this question of, you know, high levels of absence. Well, the figures are here. The headline, essentially, these variation in absence across tiers in autumn 2020 can explain pretty much all of the increase in chronic absence since the pandemic, right? So something happened in this period, drove up absences, had a knock-on effect to chronic absence, which is persisted to the present day. So if I look at achievement, I'll show you a couple of things about achievement. Just where we find effects are at key stage 2. So this is looking at key stage 2 in 2022. We don't find much for GCSEs, I think, because the GCSEs were all adjusted, right, to compensate for what was going on in the pandemic. So we don't really trust the information that's being provided by the GCSE results at that time. The key stage 2 results, well, this is just sort of looking at how those tier regulations impacted on key stage 2. The graph has a similar structure to the one I put up before, but on the y-axis now it's percentiles of key stage 2 in different subjects. Actually, what is the subject? Good question. I think I've just put. I think this is maths. This one. So this is the impact on the tier 3 in the second period, again for the most deprived to the least deprived, and these are the impacts of the other tiers. Given we've got an impact of these tiers on absence and the impact of absence potentially on future achievement, we can convert this into an estimate of the impact of absence on later achievement, right? Which is what we do here. I do have the subjects here. So on the right-hand side, we've got the ones where we've predicted absence from these tier regulations, the days in the tiers. So for maths, GPS, grade, grammar, punctuation, and spelling, and reading. So there's impacts on all of these things, right? But they're, you know, and they're huge for maths. So this is saying that 1 percentage point extra absence, you know, knocks your achievement down by over 1 percentile, which would be huge, right? So these effects look really quite big. These ones are the sort of simple thing where you just regress key stage 2 achievement on absence with a bunch of controls and much, much smaller, right? So we think these are probably going to be underestimated, but these are possibly overestimated in terms of the generalized effect of absence on achievement, right? But they do tell us something about the influence of these tiers on achievement rescaled in terms of absence at the time of the pandemic, if that kind of makes sense. All right, so that's the you know, edited highlights. Well, do we conclude? Local pandemic policies affected absence in autumn 2020, had heterogeneous impacts over different types of students. If you want to kind of figure on this, there's 16 days in either tier 2 or 3, which is pretty much where everyone was. because there were only 16 days or so that these tier regulations were in place in the second half of the term, that would drive up absence by 2.9 percentage points, bigger impact on disadvantaged students. Very persistent, especially in secondary schools and for disadvantaged pupils. The good news is, given this sort of time decay profile, if you find something that improves attendance, then it will have relatively long-lasting effects, right? So it doesn't last forever, but it will persist. So that's kind of quite good news. We found very large impacts from Key Stage 2, not for GCSEs. I've already kind of gone through the numbers, so let's talk about that. The point I was trying to make about the achievement results is that we've got a very small impact of tiers on absence in primary schools, right? The persistence of absence is relatively low, but the effect on achievement is really high. So clearly something else is going on. It's not all working through lost education. Points to the things that we're talking about here. It's something psychosocial, it's mental health, it's something else probably, yeah. The key point, these local social restrictions had unintended consequences for students, right? Which needs to be borne in mind if you're ever thinking about another pandemic and what you do during it, God forbid. So future work, we're going to do a bit more with the Understanding Society data, trying to look at more at what these tier regulations did to other aspects of family health and behaviour. And in the future work outside of the scope of what we're doing now, we're going to actually look at real years of data in the future and see how this absence persisted. Yeah. Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Great. Really fascinating. Thank you. So any questions for Steve about that presentation? We'll start in the room. Dave. Do say your name and where you're from.
I'm Dave Thompson from FFT Education. Thanks for that, Steve. Do you have any views on why London kind of escaped the worst of the pandemic, despite going into lockdown a bit more often? And what I mean by that is its rates of absence were generally lower than other regions.
Right. No, in fact, we did in the work we've done, we do look at differences between urban areas. We don't specifically isolate London, so I don't know. I don't think we've got any results that could tell us about that. Yeah, there are differences across kind of what I define as conurbations, big metropolitan areas and rural areas. But I don't know, we don't have anything that really would tell us about the mechanisms there at the moment, I don't think, or haven't thought about them, and nothing springs to mind. Yeah, I don't think I can speak to that.
No answer to that one. More questions. David.
Thanks very much. David Lundy from the University of Glasgow. When you were presenting those curves back towards the norm, do you think that is predicated on the assumption that eventually it will go back to what was the norm in 2019? And is that a safe assumption, or do you think that there might be a new equilibrium if we're talking about a new attitude towards absence?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, actually, it's kind of estimated really from what's going on between 2020 and 21. So it's kind of estimated from post-pandemic, but with the pre-pandemic thing as a kind of control, if you like, and that's sort of what's going on. So it's difficult to know, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, this is why we need to do, in the future, we need to extend it and actually look at what was happening using 23, 24 data, right? I mean, the time we got the data for the project, 21, 22 was the last year available. So we will do that at some point in the future. But I just, yeah, I think, as I say, it's estimated effectively post-pandemic from 20 to 21.
If I could just come back, because that's that period immediately before the pandemic is also a period of record high attendance following decades of initiatives from various governments to try and drive down persistent non-attendance.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so it is kind of comparing it to a baseline of low attendance. Yeah, that's right.
Other questions? At the back.
Hi, I'm Jo Hutchinson from the Education Policy Institute, and I, in a former life, used to work at DFE on absence, so this is taking me back. And this is probably a quite unfair question, but I wondered if you were tempted to look at the decay profiles after the 2008 financial crisis, because I think Marcus's chart was showing us the absence rate falling back after then. And it'd be interesting to know if we're on a similar trajectory to at that point where there were a lot more resources in the education system than there are now.
Well, we haven't done the estimation, so no, I haven't. We've only got we're using just this short period of data at the moment, you know. But yeah, I mean, again, it'd be interesting to go back and see what was going on before. Of course, we don't have the geographical variation in policies from which we're kind of estimating these effects, so it's a little tricky to do something comparable, but it's something we could think about for sure. Yeah.
Question here.
Sorry, I'd just like to almost respond to the two questions that have just been asked. So I know the 2000s period of absence policy quite well because I led the work on it in the social exclusion unit, and then when I moved on from that, followed it quite closely. And on the London question that the gentleman in front asked, London improved more than anybody else on absence in that period. So that might go to your persistence point that maybe I'd had a record of really good absence and was able to hang on to it a bit. But the other thing I'd like to say is that actually the graph you showed that persistent absence was falling from 2006, which is the first time it was ever measured. And overall absence was falling before then, from the early 2000s. And so if we're trying to work out what we do now, we might want to go back and look at the scale of what was done about absence then, because there were an awful lot of initiatives nationwide on absence rather than just a few areas.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Thank you. Do you want to pass to just to next to you there?
Just to talk about as well the 2018-2019 autumn data, it was running at 750,000. So whilst it had come down in the noughties and the tens, actually it was on a rising trajectory. So 2018 it was at 750,000. Autumn 2019 it risen by 20% to 920,000, and our research shows that really was a direct correlation to GovGib reforms and massive amounts of change in conjunction with austerity. So I think to sort of say that it was falling pre-pandemic, it wasn't. It was actually rising at an alarming rate. But I think in terms of just factoring in the fact that the reason why we've got the largest share for absence is illness, and we are in the wake of a pandemic, of a novel virus, and long COVID, and staff absence, and stress to staff absences, and for children. So I'm just curious because I think it's fascinating actually to see the tiers, and actually that, you know, we know that the North was locked down harder. We know that there's greater levels of inequality and global majority families and intergenerational households and all of that. But I suppose, how do you control for or factor in for the authorization or forced, I suppose, in conjunction with illness being the reason for the absence as opposed to the tier being the factor?
Well, the simple answer we're controlling for all the COVID infection and death rates in the regressions. So, and there's a lot of controls in here to try and take that out, especially in the first paper we're doing something where we're kind of really controlling very precisely for what was going on at that time, and it's kind of estimated from the sort of condition of a school going into a particular tier relative to it not being in here in a tier. So, you know, we're reasonably confident it's not directly due to the COVID infections. But also in terms of the absence data in the National Pupil Database, the way it's coded is there's a separate category during the COVID period for the kids being off because they actually had COVID, which we're not using. Actually, that's not included. So we're kind of missing that. We intentionally didn't include that because we wanted to sort of be less clouded by direct COVID infections, but they're tiny anyway, right? The number of kids going off because they had COVID was really small, you know, relative to everything else. So we're not, of course, we can't completely rule out that that's a factor, but we're reasonably confident amongst all the other possibilities going on. That's not what's driving it, right? But you do what you can, you know, with this sort of thing.
Last question.
Hiya, I'm Matilda Martin from TES. I was just wondering when the full, because I'm right in thinking the full report hasn't been published yet, or
for this no, we got one ready.
These kind of like interim.
We have an overview, which of an outline summary of it. Yeah.
Perfect. And is that online?
Don't know where it is at the moment. We gave it up the order.
No, yeah. Watch the space. It will come.
No, I'm just trying to.
I think we're just waiting for some feedback from the advisory group, but then it will be available. Yeah.
Okay, fab, excellent. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Absolutely fascinating presentation, and thank you for all your questions.
Thank you.
We're going to take a very short break now. We're hoping to be back at 3:15, so sort of 7-10 minutes at most. There are toilets up here and also downstairs. Feel free to use this door as well as that door. We'll move this spanner. Yes, if you could come back, we're going to start again at just after 3:15. Thank you. Great, thank you. Just a few more people coming in, but I think we'll make a start. So really pleased now to welcome Professor Lee Elliott-Major from Exeter University, who's going to take the topic onwards and pick up with COVID and look ahead to long-term trajectories and impacts from learning loss. So over to you, Lee.
A break and your brains. Oh, I can hear myself now. Just wondered what people thought of this question, and there's lots of experts in the room here, so someone's going to get quite close. What percentage of pupils in England, we're talking about, achieve grade 5 or above in English and maths GCSEs? I'm talking about the last year. Any ideas? 45. I knew someone would know the answer. You do this analysis all the time, don't you? It's really interesting when you do this with teachers. It's really interesting. You get quite a lot of estimates on that. On the online chat, did we get any estimates, by the way? I'm not sure, because we were going to do a little poll. I don't think it happened in the end, but no. Okay, right. Well, the reason I asked that question was because it relates to our research, and the reason I put this up first was, I think, you know, our research, like the others, really looked at the impact, or trying to gauge the impact of the pandemic on education and life outcomes. But I think in many ways, you'll see some of the discussion and policy proposals that we have really are about the fundamental characteristics of our education system. So while it was really about the impact of the pandemic, I think what we're raising, and some of the issues we raise, is really about the fundamental issues. Because I would argue that even at 45%, you were so close to, you obviously analyse this all the time, I think that's too low, right? I think that, for me, that is a system that's failing. And I don't think it's the children that are failing, and this is going to be my argument here. I think it's us that is failing. And it was really interesting hearing about the attendance and absenteeism debates. And I agreed with a lot of what was being spoken about, but far too often we don't listen to the parents and the pupils who aren't coming into those schools. And I think there are more profound fundamental reasons. I think it's about our curriculum. I think it's about the way we measure schools, about the way we measure people. I don't think we listen to those people. You all did very well at school, I suspect. We tend to live in these bubbles, and we talk about just knocking on people's doors, trying to get them into our schools, when we don't actually assess the system itself. So I'm going to come back to this, because some of the ideas we talk about in the report are really trying to reassess some of the fundamentals of the system. Now, what we do is in the report, and unfortunately Andy Isles, who did a lot of the data work, isn't with us today. So if there's really technical questions, I'm going to have to refer to him at some point. But we used a model, a production function model, to basically predict, and like Edward and Marcus, we used the Millennium Cohort Study to develop essentially a model of skill formation. When you look at social-emotional and cognitive development over a period of a lifetime, we looked at age 5, 11, and 14. What do those skills in those earlier stages of children's lives predict? How does that predict their GCSE outcomes? And then we looked at, given what happened during the pandemic, how did that then interfere, if you like, or limit those trajectories? And that's where we got this quite stark finding. And as Emily knows, I was on the BBC Today programme as ever talking about this finding, which is a very stark finding. It is a prediction. There's lots of obviously assumptions in that. But we predicted, because there was such a profound impact on those, particularly those children aged 5, that if you don't do anything to mitigate these things, we could actually have even a lower proportion of pupils that are getting that grade. The government, it's so confusing in England, particularly. We have a grade 4 that is a pass, and a grade 5 as well. Only in this country could we have 2 grades that are a pass, but that's the one that we looked at, a good pass. So I think there is an issue around, the pandemic did have a negative impact. But also, I think there are fundamental issues in the system as well. We got a lot of coverage, right, for press coverage for this. It actually was interesting, wasn't it, Emily? Because one of the ideas in the report came out before we actually published the report, and this was the idea that we might reduce summer holidays. I told you we were going to look at some of the fundamentals. That idea came because we were worried about the issues of holiday hunger in the summer break. And my view is we are facing such extreme inequalities in society, such levels of child poverty. I think we need to reconsider that 6-week period. I haven't convinced the government to do it yet, but it was interesting because that grabbed a lot of media attention, and it was really interesting. It was like one line in the report, wasn't it? And it was interesting for me as an experience because I ended up on the BBC One show talking about this recommendation, and none of my friends actually clearly watched the One show. So really, again, it really. Did anyone here see me on the One show? I bet not. And it really reminded me again, and I make these points and I tell these, as a bit of a joke, but I do think I worry about the fact that we do tend to be in a bubble on a lot of these debates. A lot of the things that us in this room, including me, are worried about, the very people that we want to come in school aren't the ones listening to our debate. So I think there's something we need to think about there. So anyway, so these are the things, that's one of the themes of it. Now, this is a joint endeavour. Andy Isles, Esme Lily White and Steve Machin, my fellow authors. I'm going to say things today, they probably, it's going to be a lot of my opinion as well as some of the analysis, but this was very much a joint effort. And there were different strands to this work. Some of this was just looking at what other countries did in terms of responding to the pandemic when it came to education. It amazes me how little reviews there are of what did governments do in terms of their response. So we've done as much as we could in terms of finding out from other countries how they responded. Then we've compared that to what happened in England. Of course, Wales and Scotland are different, so it was really interesting to see the different responses there. By the way, there's so little evidence of what actually was impactful, which I think is a tragedy. We'll come to the tutoring that happened, the national tutoring programme here, of course. I think it is a tragedy. It is a tragedy that we didn't, I can see Ben in the audience here, we didn't do more evaluations so that we were in a better stage now to know what type of tutoring works, how it is implemented. I think it is a national tragedy that we spent about £1 billion on that and know relatively little still about what types of tutoring could be beneficial. I'm going to talk very quickly about the model of skill formation that particularly Andy helped with. It's a model that we borrowed from Heckman, the Nobel Prize winner in the US, a paper that he did with Kuhner some years ago that applied to American data. And we essentially applied their model here. It's an economic sort of model of skill formation which I'll mention a little bit in some of the results that came from that. It was interesting hearing Marcus and Edward's results, because one of the things, and I'm not an expert on social-emotional skills, one of the things that comes out of that is that they are as important as cognitive skills in the way that we define them, which really resonates with some, I think, your findings as well. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time on low-cost equalising policy, and then we're opening up some questions, hopefully, and this will lead in, hopefully, to the panel as well. So one of the things that we also tried to do was, there was lots of studies, and many of you in the room contributed to some of these studies, and you know, there were studies done internationally about the extent of, inverted commas, learning loss, defined as something about, you know, a lower sort of exam achievement in some way. I guess a couple of things. One, it was substantial, you know, so some estimates would be about 6 months, depending on what assumptions you make on average of a learning loss in England, an extra 2 months for those from disadvantaged backgrounds, sometimes defined as free school meals entitlements, sometimes in other ways. So these were great big gaps. But what really was interesting for us was, I guess, that the disadvantaged gap seemed to be incredibly stark, whatever study was produced, and that seemed to be the case for you know, every age that was measured, and again using different ways of measuring disadvantage. Again, we have to be honest about this. The gaps were widening pre-pandemic, and it really frustrates me that we don't have a more honest debate in this country about the fact that some of the national policies that we have aren't working as well as we'd like to. Now, part of that's driven by some of the wider inequalities in society, but some of it is, in my view, that I think we're failing in some ways as an education system. So the gaps were widening, they've got wider post-pandemic. I think we can be pretty confident on that. I also worry, I have to say, about some of the claims made by governments using the OECD scores or the PISA scores. When we looked at the data for England, at least, we found that the sample sizes were not as robust as we would like. So basically, a lot of the children who weren't turning up to school weren't doing those tests. So the samples basically gave a slightly more enhanced view of what happened in England. And then I see lots of ministers and politicians claiming that England is doing better than other countries. I think that is really dodgy. If I could use other words. So we have to be careful how politicians use some of this data. It certainly seems to be cherry-picked in many ways. So you know, things have definitely got more unequal from our review. They have got unequal in more other countries as well. We'll share these slides afterwards. There's a lot of detail here. And Esme sort of led on this work and did a really amazing job in the time we had to list some of the policies and strategies that different countries tried in terms of response to the pandemic. Tutoring was a big theme everywhere. As I said, I think, you know, we're still trying to find out which types of initiatives have been more successful than others. We'll come back to that because we've got some recommendations around it. You know, in many ways, some of the results were disappointing. If you look at some of the evaluations by NFER and others on the national tutoring programme, I think, Ben, it's about a month extra, wasn't it? Some of the, in terms of children benefiting from that tutoring. The thing about tutoring is it's the way it's done that matters. When I was at the Education Endowment Foundation, we used to call the banana-rama principle we used to talk about, me and Steve, the great Steve Higgins. And that is that it's a principle that holds in all of education, which is not the thing itself that matters, it's how it's delivered, it's who it's delivered by. Sorry? So, and I do worry because I think that there is a sort of negative feeling about tutoring. If you go to schools now, it's really, and I think actually there's still a lot to be said for tutoring done in the right way with teachers, with schools. So perhaps we can get into that into a discussion. I'm not going to go through the whole area here, but I think the thing that came across, I think that Esme really found from her various analyses was that when you looked at England compared to the other countries, we did far less in terms of what we called extracurricular activities. So these were not just academic type exercises. This could be about arts, it could be about sport, it could be also it related to well-being as well. So in our view, some of the pandemic responses, and again, there's very limited sort of evidence on which ones actually worked, but it's certainly, in our view, sort of revealed some of the country differences in terms of our priorities of education systems. And we would argue that England, we don't have enough consideration of some of those other things. Again, it'd be interesting in views on that. But that was the sort of the main finding from that analysis. Okay. The maths bit. I'm not going to go through these equations, and there's some very clever people in this room, and I'm very happy to go through some of the detail of this. But essentially, Andy's part of the project was to produce these predictions. This is a dynamic model, so it's looking at measuring, as I said, social-emotional skills, cognitive skills. We also looked at parent investments as well at different ages. For time, I'm not going to go into all of this, but basically it's a very clever and robust analysis of trying to predict what's happening to these children. There's all sorts of assumptions in this, as any study, and there's certain ways that we define social-emotional skills and cognitive skills. As I said, I came into this as someone who's not an expert in social emotional skills, and so some of the findings came as a surprise to me in many ways, but they resonated certainly with the other studies that have been presented today. So one of the first things was to say that, and it may not surprise people here perhaps, but social emotional skills as we define them were as important as cognitive skills in achieving good GCSEs. We looked at grade 5s and we looked at the consequences, the possible consequences after school. Now, social emotional skills are important in terms of how children interact with their teachers. They're also important in how children manage an examination, right? So again, I'm just emphasizing this because I don't think in the current English system, we think about this as much as we should do in terms of how we help children in the classroom. Lots of debates about whether you can develop social emotional skills and how you do that and what contributes to that. But it was certainly a clear finding that we found from our model. So there's just one finding here that was really interesting for me, was that at age 14, those pupils that had done very well in the cognitive tests, they'd had average social emotional skills. They actually didn't get that. Again, we defined it 5 good GCSEs. So these things are really critical at these different life stages. There was a particular emphasis for girls. Interesting. There was a gender divide as well in terms of social emotional skills being more important for girls at age 14 than boys in terms of those GCSE outcomes. So, 5 minutes left. My God. Okay. So. Coming to the findings then, and then I just want to quickly go through some of the ideas that we presented. This is a table, an international table of social mobility, income mobility, actually, that me and Steve Machin did some time ago. And I suppose I just want to emphasize that when we looked at what this might mean for social mobility, and of course social mobility relates to essentially a sort of measure of equality of opportunity in society, that this could go down by 15% given our sort of estimates. That would make us even worse. So this would be a higher number on here. This is the opposite of social. This is the earnings elasticity. This is the link from one generation to another, from your mum and dad, what your mum and dad's characteristics were to what your characteristics are at age 37 we look at. We predict there'll be an even stronger link unless we address some of these big issues. Again, there's lots of assumptions in that. So what did we suggest that a new government might consider? Well, one thing is, despite, as I say, the lack of evidence and evaluation of tutoring, we think there is some really good ideas, one of which is using undergraduates. I think universities should contribute to this. I think they should have a far stronger civic role. I think actually I would argue that every undergraduate should give back in some way. In America, some really interesting models of service learning where undergraduates have to do something in their degree towards helping others. We're developing this. We've piloted this in Exeter and elsewhere. The key thing about this is we do it with teachers. It's not done to schools, it's done with them. It's also about mentoring as well as tutoring. It's not just about the academic side. It's a wonderful thing to see when you go and visit these things, where you get these young undergraduates, they get a degree credit. The pupils, the pilot studies have suggested the pupils boost their sort of base, this is writing skills. And also some of those undergrads consider a career in teaching, which, you know, do not underestimate that as a potential benefit. In the time I've got, I just want to pick up, we talked about enrichment guarantee, so that children, we're thinking about arts and sports that have been squeezed out of the current curriculum. Again, I think we need to look at that curriculum in terms of how we serve children. Lots here. I think the other two I'll probably talk about, Ofsted inspections, it needs reforming. At the moment, there is no recognition of schools doing incredibly amazing jobs in disadvantaged communities. I think the current system, it's just not good for our teacher profession. So we talk about rebalancing Ofsted inspections. I don't think a school should get an outstanding rating unless it can prove that it is an inclusive school. I think there are too many, and this is again another thing we don't speak about too much in this country. There are a lot of trusts and schools who do not take on their fair share of children from different backgrounds. So we sort of talk about rebalancing Ofsted. A lot of this, by the way, wouldn't take a lot of money. Sandra, Steve and I have just produced an analysis for CEP for the election analysis where we say, of course, schools need more money. There's no doubt about that. But in this report, we were just trying to think of other ideas that didn't actually cost that much. But they are quite fundamental ideas. We also then lastly talked about, could we have a new deal for teachers? At the moment, they are working incredibly long hours. And we have this, I don't know if there's any experts in the room on this, but we have directed and undirected time for teachers. They're just spending a lot of undirected time doing more and more. So we think we need to clarify actually the working hours for our teachers. And then finally, I won't give up on this one, I think we need a more balanced school calendar. The idea being that we have extra holidays in the autumn term. It's a long term for teachers and pupils. And we were really struck by the evidence around holiday hunger and other issues around that long summer break. So I'm going to stop there because of time. I hope that provoked some of you, and very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Lee. Really interesting. I wonder if initially we could focus our questions on the social, emotional and cognitive skills and what was going on there in relation to learning loss and school closures during COVID. Has anyone got any questions about that aspect of the research, Matilda? And just while we're answering that one, just to encourage our online audience as well to ask some questions, and then we'll take those from Ruth in a moment. Thank you.
Just looking forward to any incoming government with the election coming up in the next few days. I was just wondering, do you think that there needs to be a renewed strategy in terms of catch up from that new government? And also, do you think that, you know, obviously I care, but do you think the wider public care enough about the messaging of catch up and the need for it still? I think it's quite hard to cut through on the impact of, you know, repeated school closures and everything else going on in the pandemic, and cut through to the importance to the public. How do you think a new government will be able to do that?
Yeah, I'm going to challenge whoever comes in. I mean, you know, I think it's a disgrace that we have not had more discussion about child poverty and inequality in this election campaign. You know, it's almost like there is this conspiracy of silence among all our politicians. I think it's disgraceful. You know, every time I watch any debate, there is very little discussion about the profound issues affecting a lot of children in this country. I partly think it's because we have a political elite. This is not a political point, a political elite that are increasingly detached from the everyday issues, the people that they're meant to serve. So I do think there's an issue with politics generally. Yes, I do think the new government's going to have to think some very fundamental things. We talk about here about this amazing trial in Manchester looking at measuring well-being of children in schools as well as academic attainment. I think these are quite fundamental things. I think we're going to have to listen more, as I said, to those parents. When I do my trips around schools, what I find is that there is a sort of deficit approach almost to parents and children. We treat as inferior who've got to fit into our system rather than actually evaluating whether our curriculum actually genuinely serves all our children. That's why I put that statistic up earlier, because I think that's a sign of our failure as a system. So I think there's some really profound things. And that Ofsted idea, that's quite profound as well. We have a system at the moment. The implicit assumption of our system is we don't mention disadvantage, right? For fear, this is a sort of Govian assumption, that if you mention disadvantage, it lowers our expectations of those children. I could not disagree more with that. I think we need to be explicit about disadvantage. We need to recognise it. And of course, we need to think about expectations around the children. So these are, even though they're low-cost ideas, they're quite fundamental. So yeah, I think that the new government needs to think fundamentally about these issues. Otherwise, I would argue that some of the things we've all been presented today will be the same in 10 years' time. I honestly believe that.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ruth next to hear from our online audience.
Thanks. I've got a question from somebody who wholeheartedly agrees with you that we should avoid a deficit approach that blames pupils, but wants to kind of see if you've got more to say on whether the system can really mend itself to include those pupils or whether we need more radical solutions.
So one of the things I've been really interested in across the school sector has been the development of community hubs. I don't know if many of you have seen that across, and sometimes these evolve around food banks. This is kind of where we are again in terms of a society. And the reason I quite like those models is because I think they create neutral spaces for parents who themselves had a bad experience of schooling earlier in their lives. And you do not underestimate how alienating a school can be if you yourself have had that experience. And I think there's some really exciting models across the country, actually, in terms of what we call community hubs. I think the tension there is, are we going to help schools with resource to do all that? Because for those schools, there is a balancing act here with how do we develop our teachers and give them time to develop while you're also effectively working as community hubs. So I think that I like, because for me, all the stuff about absenteeism, I think that has a chance to bridge those broken relationships that I observe across the country. There's some really good practice actually across the system.
And one more.
One more from online. Looking at your low-cost equalising policies, wondering whether there might be some conflict between the enrichment guarantee and the New Deal for teachers, which surely can't be met without an increased spend on the education budget. Yeah,
we did think about this, the contradictions. I mean, in the report, it was an advisor who was on the advisory group, and thanks to the advisory group, by the way, who basically said to us, don't ask for more money. His view was. So we sort of took that on, but in the report, and certainly in the analysis I published today with Steve and Sandra and others, we do say that schools need extra investment. We're not saying that. We're just saying if you don't have immediate investment, here's some things you could do, which I was arguing for earlier, actually have quite fundamental implications for the education system.
Thank you. Got time for one more question from the room. Your hand is up first. You sure? Okay. Anyone who hasn't had all right. Thank you.
Okay. I failed my maths O level, but I'm an emeritus professor.
Could you say your name and so that
Sally Tomlinson. I love your passion, actually, because a lot of educational research seems so unpassionate and full of, things we have trouble understanding. But I love, your low-cost policies are absolutely right. And because I'm an old woman, lady, some of these have actually been tried before. I mean, I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, we had these parent-teacher partnerships, and we really worked at that. And of course, they disappeared during the 90s. And also, I love the way you have looked at other countries, because so much of our policy is dedicated to just, narrow sort of what we do and not looking at other countries. I mean, I just have to say that, you know, until we actually change our education system and stop the marketisation, the competitiveness, the narrow curriculum, it's not surprising a lot of young people don't want to come to school. You know, we've got that. But one policy that isn't around is that has been adopted is this alternative provision. And increasingly, a lot of children are now being excluded from schools. I mean, the numbers in England, particularly excluded, are rising. And alternative provision has become a policy, put these children in. Now, some alternative provision schools, or a lot of them were PRU or referral units, but now they're becoming alternative provision. There are also a lot of unregistered provision, which is very, very worrying. But in some of these AP schools, some of these things are actually being tried. You know, hubs for curriculum hubs to think about the curriculum. Definitely self-esteem and working on children's, you know, self-esteem and feeling good about themselves. A change curriculum where it's not just grind, more maths, more English all the time. So, you know, if you'd add or consider some of the good practice that's actually being, I don't approve of AP schooling. I think, you know, we ought to have an education system for everybody, but there's good work going on there we can take note of.
Thank you very much. I mean, what I would say is, you know, I look back at some of the policies in '97, for example, and Sure Start being one of them, of course, you know, and I look back and I think we lost a lot of really good policies, you know, and I think I think it's a national tragedy that the children's centres were allowed to sort of dwindle in this country. Yeah, there was a time where other countries looked at us with envy. So I think I have to say the period of austerity hit us. The reason I'm passionate about this is because I don't think education gets enough airing in the public debates. And I think part of it is because all the studies today they tend to be quite long-term consequences, and so they're not as maybe immediate as health or something. But I really think we've got to push our politicians to talk a bit more about it because it's so important for our young generations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee, and to all the research presenters. Really fascinating. And thank you for your questions. We are going to move now to the panel discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Josh Hillman, Director of Education here at the Foundation, to get us going with that. Thank you.
If the panel would like to come up, sorry, Ed and Daniela and Anna. Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. And I thought that was a really fantastic discussion so far. I mean, I want to open this up, but I also think it's really important that we try to focus a bit more, particularly on issues around absence and attendance. Before I introduce the panel, and I'll open up a sort of informal discussion with them before we open up for questions and points from the floor. I just wanted to take stock a little bit on where I think we are specifically on the attendance issue. I mean, we've talked a lot so far about the scale and nature of the problem and how it's changed over time, and in particular how the pandemic had such a sustained effect, such as no one can remember that in living memory, that kind of change in attendance. We've talked about the causes of high absence rates at pupil levels, at school levels, and at the system level, including the short-term and longer-term impacts of the pandemic and the different policies that were undertaken at a local level to deal with that. Some of the economic and family factors that also have played in. And I think we've started to touch on, but I hope we'll explore more, some of the changes in the attitudes of parents and pupils, in fact, to that relationship that they have with schools, and that sort of sense of an erosion, not quite a breakdown, but an erosion of that contract between parents and pupils and schools. And then we've talked about the consequences of absence and the significance of the consequences at the individual level for pupils and at the system level, the obvious relationship between absence and attainment. Really interesting discussions about how that plays through in terms of the relationships between cognitive and non-cognitive skills like socioeconomic, social and emotional skills, which we might explore. The inevitable widening of the disadvantage gap. High rates of absence inevitably contribute to that. And you know, Lee's point, really important point, that you know, as soon as you start breaking down the relationship between advantage and education, you're getting into the whole social mobility effects, which will have a much longer term impact. And then I hope we can also talk about other consequences around the challenges of classroom management when you lose that continuity of having pupils coming in and out. It's not just the kids who are not there are affected, it's going to be the others, whilst the teacher is, you know, with limited resources, trying to kind of deal with big chunks of lost learning for those individuals. So let's really try and focus on when we're talking about strategies for policymakers, but also strategies for school leaders to address the specific issues around absence. It's really easy to sort of pull the camera right back and say, well, absence is just a reflection of fundamental problems in the education system. You've got the fragmented governance and support for schools, which means that people say, well, it's all very well for a large MAT to be able to deal with this, but what about more isolated schools? We know the curriculum's not fit for purpose, so there's clearly need for change in that, and the decline of extracurricular activities and arts and sports is clearly also contributing. Teacher supply is also playing a part, and of course funding of schools in general. I'm not suggesting we should totally avoid that in this second half of the seminar, but I do think on the sort of spectrum between wider systemic reform and the specific approaches that we might take to the attendance issue, we should veer towards that latter end of the spectrum, partly on the grounds that we you know, other events and other reports are available that are in our work and the work of others that are dealing with that. So to the panel, and I'll just introduce them as I go on. First, I think importantly first, because it's really important to foreground the experience of actual schools, which we haven't heard from today. So Daniela Grasso is such a fantastic head teacher that she's been given 2 schools to be the head teacher of, both primary schools in Acton that are part of the ARC Multi-Academy Trust. And the reason we invited Daniela to be with us is that, you know, her schools face really quite significant challenges that other schools have often used as reasons for having particularly high absence rates, but yet her schools have incredibly low absence rates, which they've had really, including actually during the pandemic in terms of engagement. So I guess I just wanted to open up by asking you how you did it.
And I think just for clarity, one of my schools, like Priory, has 50% pupil premium. So we are, even though the schools are literally 10 minutes walk from each other, the catchment area is significantly different, and the deprivation one school faces isn't quite the same in the other. And I think, you know, talking about, it's really interesting, the last slide that you showed, a lot of the things that were on that slide, we do, you know, as a school, and it's something that we're known for within ARC. But I think after the COVID lockdown, on reflections, what was really important and why our attendance was sustained was that we tried to keep school as the same as we could during that lockdown. We did have the benefit of if you go back, I hate going back because I hate being reminded, it was an awful time for schools and for head teachers to not have our community in the building. But if you go back, the second lockdown, we had a bit of time to prepare. We kind of saw it coming, and ARC did put together a digital strategy which did support that second lockdown, which allowed all children across the network from year 3 to secondary to have a device at home, a laptop at home, because we realised during that first lockdown how that stopped us teaching without those devices. So we were very lucky in that sense. What was unique about Priory is the consistency of how we kept the school day. We had morning registration the same online. We expected all children to be there. We even sang the school song like the children would do. Parents hated me. And, you know, the same for afternoon registration. And like we would in school, if we didn't see the child online, we would follow that up with a phone call. What's happened? Why is the pupil not there, etc., etc. And I think just in maintaining academic standards as well, children had lessons. Obviously, they were virtual. We still did the small group work that the teacher would do for specific children within that time. They still had to, at the end of a lesson, hand in a piece of work that was then marked, and feedback was given in the same way as we would in school. So the consistency was kept the same. And I think because we kept as much as we could the same for our children, including doing PE, which was like a virtual dance lesson that children can then, you know, there was lots of filming themselves doing these activities and sending them in. We used something called Seesaw, which was really interactive for children as well and really great. We didn't see our attainment drop during COVID as well, which I think was something that we were really proud of. And once we returned to school, the dip in attendance that we did see was actually from a lot of our families who are international families actually going home for longer periods of time during term time to see family that they'd not seen during the COVID years. You know, obviously we had to do a big push around why school's important and reminding families about what school's about. And we've seen that steady off now. So we are back in, you know, the over 95%, and we've seen our our persistent absence decline this year. It was 18% last year. It's now 11% this year. And I think, you know, on the point that we've all spoken to, knowing each family is key with this work around attendance. It's great to have all of the structures and systems in place. For example, looking at data, that early intervention work is important. I can say that for myself in school. But we really know all our families, and we know why the non-absence is happening. We know what they need. We work with them. We do have a lot of parents who didn't have a great experience at school. They find it actually physically difficult to come into the building. We worked with, I think it was the University of Nottingham, to introduce something called Early Start, I think it was, the programme. Good Start, Great Start, there we go. And that's a programme to help families to come in a little bit, work with their children, work with the early years team to build the confidence in parents in that school relationship. So we spend a lot of our time of senior leaders is making sure that relationship is strong from day one, from our nursery. So I have a nursery at Priory. I think that was it.
Yeah, that's
a lot.
I mean,
I could carry on, but I thought, you know.
I'm sure head teachers around the country who might watch this on Catch Up will be jotting all that down. I mean, because of that experience and because of that success, you were asked by the DFE to lead one of their 32 absence hubs, attendance hubs, which is a cheap and cheerful policy. You find outstanding schools that have tackled this problem, and you spread good practice by asking them to form those networks on the grounds that learning lessons from people who've done well is a good form of overall improvement. So what from your experience of leading that hub, and I should say that these schools are dispersed around the country. They're not geographically concentrated, but so it's making sure that the schools are of a similar type, which makes sense. What's your experience of what's worked about that strategy in terms of you being able to do that, and what have been some of the challenges for you?
I mean, I think what works is, so just to let the audience know, the DFE gave me no guidance. It was, please sort out attendance for us. You've got 6 sessions over a period of time. Create a CPD programme for school leaders, which I obviously, as you can tell, I did really enjoy doing it. And I think we're halfway through this at the moment. And I think what's really been positive is allowing school leaders the space to talk about it. And obviously there's so many similarities from the Northeast to London to the South Coast. We are finding the same problems across the country. I think what was surprising to me is when I did have my initial conversations with the DFE and with, you know, what this content would be, what would we talk about from Priory, was that some of the things to me were very basic and other schools weren't doing it. And so for me, I think next steps for the DFE is codifying the approach towards looking at data, codifying the expectations around even something simple as the letters we send to parents around attendance. Some schools didn't have that. You know, we talked about how could that be inclusive, which was one of the things that schools really loved. They gave feedback that to me recently. Instead of having numbers, using a pie chart, for example, for our families who perhaps don't speak English but need to hear the same message so they can visually see what we're talking about when we're referring to their child's attendance. And just being mindful that, you know, it isn't just about parents, it's what you're doing as a school as well. So last year we started mentoring some of our year sixes in year 5 who we knew, again, early intervention, perhaps would find year 6 difficult, and thinking around, you know, talking to all the schools that there's things to do in terms of policies, paperwork, data, but a lot of it is curriculum, relationships, well-being, and personal development of pupils themselves, so they actually understand why we're in school, what we're learning for, what's this going to do for your future, what does that future look like. So again, it's really hard to give it in a very small statement, because there's lots of things I think that you're nodding. I think you might say something that is similar to me.
I will bring in Anna now. Anna Feuchtwang, who's the Chief Executive of the National Children's Bureau. So she obviously works with, she's outside of the education system, but works with children in a variety of ways outside of their lives in schools. And I just wonder, sort of, can you build on that, drawing on some of the work that NCB has done, particularly just focused for now on school practice, and then we can maybe go beyond that afterwards.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think one of the first things to say is that leadership is really important, as I think has just been demonstrated. That's one of the things we know about our own research. And we've talked a little bit about inclusive schools here. Sometimes this is we talk about a whole school approach to mental health and well-being, and we were looking at this and the evidence for this before the pandemic, where the focus is not just on academic attainment and not seeing academic attainment as the be-all and end-all of everything, but actually how does the school support every child to do whatever they can do to be their best. And I will disclose here, Lee, that I did really badly at school. So I left school with no qualifications, and therefore I hope I'm a living example of someone that can achieve despite that. So the things that we're mostly looking at through the National Children's Bureau's family group is things like the impact of bullying for schools and for school attendance and how pupils feel, particularly therefore those children that are most disproportionately represented in school absence, those kids with special educational needs and disabilities, and children from socio-economic deprived backgrounds. And we know this. What is frustrating is that some of the policies that we were discussing when we were looking at this through the Attendance Alliance, which is the Department for Education's group, quite rightly set up to look at this, focused on the universal, but not on those children that they were finding it hardest to bring back into the school environment. And that's because we already had, as we've all talked about here, 10 years of austerity measures, poor support for schools, and more pressures placed on schools and teachers to provide pastoral care that they weren't given the resources for. So we have also within our networks lots of examples of really excellent, outstanding practice that is not necessarily high cost. And that's when you have a whole school approach to mental health and well-being. And now one of the areas we're looking at is a sense of belonging. And I was really interested in some of the evidence that we were looking at today about, you know, if you've been away from school for a long time, how do you feel that you ever belong again? So we're now starting a 10 pilot program with schools in London that's looking at codifying some of the practice you brilliantly described, which is none of this is new. Those people that have been around for a while will know that we've looked at this through various different lenses, but it is about the tools that teachers have to support a whole school approach to mental health and well-being, but also the relationships that teachers and school staff have with parents, and importantly, that the problems around absenteeism and non-attendance are not put at the doors of the students and the parents themselves, but an understanding of why those children are no longer able to attend. So I think I'm hard agreeing with you, but thinking about some of the really practical tools that schools can use that can increase students' feelings of belonging and well-being.
And can you say now a little bit more about some of the agencies that are outside of schools and addressing some of the issues that are outside of the control of schools that are, of course, impacting on pupils' attendance?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're probably commonly known by everybody in this room. But actually, if you look at the overall system that supports students, parents, families, and schools, many of those parts of the system are increasingly unable to provide the support that students need, and particularly children with special educational needs and disabilities. So some of the frustration is that if you schools that should have ordinary available provision to allow kids to attend can't, because it could be something to do with the school transport system or the two-school transport system. It could be to do with obviously the sort of major impact of the cost of living crisis and high levels of poverty. And I'd be really interested to see how the research that, thank you for the research, because it's really important to have that longitudinal research too. But if we can look at what's happened with the cost of living crisis and school attendance going forward. So there are many issues around that. And I think that poor mental health and really low self-esteem amongst young people that have been through the pandemic, plus then the inability of the health system to support those children and young people, will carry on having a really strong impact on whether young people feel they're able to attend. And just something on alternative provision that was raised earlier. Alternative provision are finding it really hard to then reintegrate children back into mainstream education. And they are seeing, and this is fairly anecdotal at the moment, but it would be good to do some more research on this, that as schools off-roll the students they find more difficult to support into AP, they're not as willing to take those students back again, even if you've seen a massive improvement in the way those children are able to attend school.
Now, Ed Dorrell, who is one of the partners at Public First, but in a previous life had a sort of bird's eye view of the education system as an education journalist. I just want to start, Ed, by asking you about a specific piece of work that you did on absence, which is taking the direct perspective of parents. You know, we've heard about parents indirectly so far this afternoon, but what does the research, which was really deep qualitative research, what did that show about the parental perspective, and how has that shaped your own thinking about attendance and related issues, and how's that related to what you've heard so far in this discussion?
Yeah, what a big and broad-ranging question that is. So I'll tell you about how the research came to pass. We, Public First, run qualitative research and focus groups on all sorts of subjects, including politics, but a lot on education. And Lindsay at CPO, UCL, many people here will know, came to us the autumn before last, I think, and said, we've got a load of interventions which we think can make a difference to social mobility. We're going to recommend them in a manifesto. Can you test some of them with parents? And I'd been thinking about the attendance crisis for a while and written bits and pieces about it for various media, but we'd not done any hard research on it. And I had 20 minutes in a 1 hour and 15-minute focus group to talk to these random group of parents in New York who we'd recruited. They weren't parents with bad attendance records. They were just completely normal, lower middle class parents in a fairly working class bit of York. And 20 minutes to talk to them about attendance, and that 20 minutes blew my mind. It became apparent unbelievably quickly, at least for this group, that the relationship they had with school was completely different as a result of COVID. The social contract, lots of people use this phrase now, and I'm going to claim credit for it, it was mine. The social contract between parents and schools was destroyed by COVID. I'm not here to say we shouldn't have closed schools because of COVID. It was a necessary evil, but it definitely happened. It was a shocking 20 minutes. So as a result of which, I went out and did some fundraising and found some people to fund us to do what many academics around here, I'm sure, would say was not sufficiently academic, but a big bit of qualitative research. We ran, I think, 12 or 13 focus groups around the country across demographics. Apart from one group where we actively recruited parents with profound persistent absence problems, these were all normal parents. The only thing I asked was that they didn't have 100% attendance, because obviously you don't want them to dominate a group. And the patterns that I'd seen in those 20 minutes in that first focus group were replicated across all social grades, across all geographies. The relationship between schools and parents in terms of the idea that we have mandatory full-time education, that you send your kid to school every day unless they're very sick, had gone. There's one or two schools around the country where that isn't replicated, but it was amazing how persistent and consistent it was. Lots and lots of reasons for that. We can unpack, I mean, I don't know how we can unpack loads of them. I mean, primarily, if you tell kids that they don't have to go to school for in total 6 months, it's very hard to put that genie back into the bottle. To the point earlier about politicians making a case for catch up. No one wants to talk about this, right? Parents don't want to talk about it. Schools don't tell their kids that they've fallen behind and they're still behind because of COVID. No one wants to persistently hear that their kids are behind. It's not a story that people want to hear or be told about. So if you're being told that your kid's doing fine by your school, and then you say, well, they've been in school for 6 months, it's clearly fine to be out for a few days here or there. And then you have a logical conversation. I'll stop rambling in a minute. You have a logical conversation, which is quite hard to argue with. And they'll say, but the last few days of term, all they do is watch films and do sports day. That's not, every day doesn't matter. And it's actually quite hard to make an argument about that. Because I've got 2 kids at primary age, and they aren't literally doing English and maths for 5 hours every day. That's not what's happening, especially at the end of the summer term. So there's loads of stuff to go on there. But I'll pick out a few things. The point about enrichment is, I think, really important, because we've got to change the language. We've got to talk to parents differently about why every day in school matters. And the idea of a school as a whole community, a shared experience, socialization, the social and emotional health, as a mental well-being, that your kid will miss out on lots of developmental stuff that isn't just, you know, making sure that you don't miss that one phonics lesson. Not that phonics isn't important, it is. You know, building a story about a school as a community where parents have a relationship with the school as well as the young people. This is the way you change the dynamic. And we can talk extensively about all sorts of other stuff that went on, including the absolute persistent message that we heard that it was fine, basically, to take your kids on holiday during term time. Everyone agreed in these focus groups. I'm sure everyone in this room would be horrified, but literally nobody was embarrassed about it. It was fine. This is what we do now. We didn't do it before COVID. Now we do it. Loads of other messages. I'll send it to you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to open it up now for some contributions, starting from people within the room, but then I'll bring people online as and when. So who would like to kick off with a point or a question? Peter. Please say who you are for everybody. Yeah.
which I think they're doing an incredible job about. And therefore, I want to suggest something that might link the panel here to the researchers that are there. And I think what we're missing. And what we're missing is an understanding of how much, when we see attendance, it's the fault of a school as opposed to the fault of society in general. We've learned both things both ways. It wouldn't be hard, I think, for the quantitative researchers that we've seen here to set up databases that allow you to take into account individual pupil characteristics, school characteristics, locations, and say, this school is doing much better than expected, and this school's got a problem. And not only would that be good information for schools and governments, it would get rid of the nonsense coming from Ofsted, but it would also allow you to start to look for interventions at those schools that are above the trend.
Thanks very much. Just can you, Matilda, that's
is it light green? Should be working.
Sorry, just in terms of kind of changing that narrative around community about transport, do you think ultimately that needs to come centrally from government, that change of messaging, or do you think it's something that schools actually need to do on their own? Just thinking as an expected new government coming up, how they might be thinking about that.
I mean, to Professor Timms' point as well, I think this is definitely a systemic problem, right? I don't think schools can be expected to do it on their own. And I do think the accountability system plays a role in it, for sure. And I think, I'll get completely physical for a second. You look at Bridget Phillipson's speech at the CSJ in January or February. I think it's the most substantive speech she's given. If you kind of read the speech properly and look at it, actually what you realise is that she sees attendance as the frame through which all of her other policies flow. So there was a recognition, at least in the hopefully incoming government, that attendance is a really profound problem, and Ofsted reform, the report card that Lee talked about, Sure Start 2.0 that I hope there's a very good chance Labour will get to if the money begins to flow at some stage. A lot of the stuff that they talk about, breakfast clubs is another one. You're beginning to see a conception of school at a political level as more than just, I hate the phrase exam factory because exams are important, but more than just school entities that are there to drive kids through exams to get results. So to answer your question, I think it is really important that we see this in its totality.
in terms of Peter's question, before we come on to others, I mean, I think that's partly a data and research question. I wonder if any of the researchers here, particularly in the audience, would like to maybe say whether they think it's feasible as a way of moving forward. Does anyone want to have a go at that? Come on, we're a research funder. There we go. Sandra.
Well, what struck me is that it would be wonderful to be able to do such a thing, but it would also be quite difficult, and you might be in danger of blaming the school. You might say this school's exceptional, that school's less exceptional, without really understanding the qualities of the intake of the school. Because you use administrative data to do that, but administrative data doesn't give you a very rich information about, the families that are going to the school, the particular environment that people are sending the school in. And given we do know that a lot of what happens to children in terms of their outcomes is to do with their families. It's not necessarily through the actual school itself, and that's where I think the difficulty would be, just trying to take those two things apart.
Yes, Sophia.
I was just wondering, as a Horizon Scanning Manager at the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, I was just wondering if there are any other countries that have had similar school closures and then a return, if there are frameworks or guidance that their governments have used that we could look to, or that where it has had a more positive response in terms of absenteeism or just a better reaction to taking holidays in term time and that kind of thing.
Lee's probably best placed to answer that.
Do you want to have a go?
I mean, what we found when
when Esme looked at some of these, to be honest, we didn't find anything that was very different to what we were trying here. What we did find was that there was similar trends in other countries. It seems to be a kind of universal phenomenon, which is kind of interesting. The other things I would say to add to this debate, Josh, is we also have to think of absenteeism in schools as well, because I do get a little frustrated with debates that just say we just got to get them in there, because there's lots of research, and in mine and others included, that will show that even when they're in the school, they might not be in the classroom, and when they're in the classroom, they're not interacting with the teacher. So I think sometimes it can be a bit crude, this debate. We just get them in the school gates and it'll all be sorted. I know you've got to keep focus on it, Josh, but I just think there is also an issue about what's happening in the school again for me.
Thanks. One more and then we'll go online.
Harriet from Quorum Children's Charity, in particular SCARF, PSHE framework and charity. The focus on belonging that you talked about and that you talked about in ARC around what you did during COVID and what you do to create that kind of community is so important, and giving young people, we know there's lots of drivers to school absence and non-attendance, but one of the key drivers being a sense of belonging. And we carry out at Quorum a young people's survey, so to give their voice front and centre for care experienced children, looked after children. And it's remarkable that their sense of enjoyment of school is higher than those who aren't looked after. So given the challenges for some of that age cohort, that cohort of children, they feel such a strong sense of connection and belonging and community and place at school. So I wanted to make that point about looked after children, but also ask a bit more about how you've created the sense of belonging and place for your children across ARC.
Over to you, Danielle.
So at ARC Priory, we have something that's tangible for children to understand. We call it the ARC Priory Child, very well named. And it's a set of characteristics that we think children should have and should be developed throughout their time in our school. So things like integrity, things like kindness. And we talk about these often and we refer to them all throughout the school day. So from assembly to the lessons, we're being collaborative now. We're trying to be like the ARC Priory Child. And by the time the children understand that we want them to develop these skills, so, you know, for us, academic outcomes are not good enough. That's not enough to get that seat on the table and to be able to talk to others, to be able to be independent of thoughts, but also be respectful. So they understand that that's the who we are, and the how we do it is our school values. So we explore, endeavour and excel. And that sense of belonging for our children comes through the ARC Priory Child, and we're able to have conversations with parents about what that looks like. So it's really useful when we're having conversations around behaviour. You know, we refer to our expectations through that visual and through that easy understanding for both parents and children. And I think with the wider ARC network, what we have started doing, I think this is something really significant, is looking at personal development as a network and providing opportunities beyond the classroom. So we've started a lot of primary sports activities. The West London hub, I think, has about 10 primary schools. So our children are often going to other schools to take part in sports activities, music activities. So it's things beyond you know, academic learning that actually builds up resilience and confidence for all children. So other children who perhaps aren't academically able can still succeed because there's an opportunity to show their skills in a different way. And I think that's something, again, I didn't make the point in, you know, my opening comments, but children enjoying school is what makes them come to school. Yeah. I mean, I know that sounds really stupidly obvious, but you know, the children, you know, we do a lot of pupil voice work as well, both through the ARC Central, but also ourselves on, you know, day to day. They love it. If I'm a second late to open the gate in the morning, there's like a herd of children coming at me and, you know, they nearly trample over me to get into class. And I think it's building that safe space for children where they can be themselves. But also, again, we talk a lot about respecting others, listening to others. We do a lot of work with Voice 21 and building oracy skills so children can express themselves. And I just want to tell you a story about a child that, you know, could be a non-attender at school. She's a little girl who's a selective mute. And you would think in an oracy, you know, use within a lesson, she wouldn't have a role. But because of the work that we do with Voice 21 and the skills that the children have learned, she has a part to mark who's speaking and when. So she's actively involved in that activity, whatever that is, and has a role and is able to then go to her class teacher, who she's built a relationship with, and whisper what she needs to, but she doesn't feel not included. And I think inclusion, again, is something that we focus on a lot. We talk about it a lot with staff, that adaptive learning, ensuring that all children are reaching the potential that they can, is really, really important to us. And I think, you know, for non-education based people in the room, it's really hard to be a teacher. And I think we forget that when we have these conversations around policy, around attendance. Sometimes it feels so abstract to the reality of the day-to-day. And, you know, appreciating Lee's points about shorter school holidays. I think I was one of those people that was like, absolutely not. But, you know, I mean, we're going off topic there. Perhaps we can catch up later. But I'll explain my reasons why I have good reasons. But, you know, again, looking at the holidays, what the children get, what's the offer, that's something we also consider. So there isn't just that stop-start to school. There's still an expectation throughout the school holidays that we want you to do this, we want you to think about this.
Just coming back to the earlier part of your response to Harriet's question about belonging and the transferability of some of that to secondary schools, where, you know, we've seen the challenges of absence are higher. How much of the what you described comes from you being quite a well-resourced, active MAT that has quite a lot of continuity? Pupils move from primary schools into secondary schools because it's relatively localized. Can you see that sort of, is that model transferable to schools that may be not part of that kind of MAT?
I think so, and I think it's about, again, the successful secondary schools in terms of attendance within the MAT that I've been to meetings at. Just what I see around me visually is encouraging to children. There's an obvious purpose, there's an obvious sense of belonging in terms of, you know, some schools have houses, for example, and so there's that belonging to something within the building. I feel you want to jump in there because you probably know more about secondary than me, but it's doable, I think.
It's definitely doable. The research, the literature review we did looked across primary and secondary schools, and the whole range, including alternative provision and special schools. And creating a sense of belonging can be not only codified, but tools can be provided to schools, which is why we're piloting it across both secondary and primary schools. And we're not doing it only in schools where they're already doing this successfully. We're deliberately doing it in schools that haven't managed to do this so far. So the idea of it is that following the literature review, that we can provide, a whole range of tools that schools can use that can create a sense of belonging. And it's really interesting hearing both your question and what you said, because I had a list of what creates a sense of belonging and you ticked all of them. So it's stuff that we know. It is about the relationships. It's about schools being a fair place. It's about those extracurricular activities that make the school inclusive, because all children can take part in them, even if they're not academically successful naturally. So it is that whole range of issues that create a sense of belonging, and all schools are able to could put that in place without it being high cost.
Thanks. Let's take 2 or 3 questions from the online audience.
And fold in a few different points that have been made online to give a flavour of what's been said there, although some of what you've just been talking about to tackle some of these issues. So I'll start. One person was asking about how much we know about the reasons for the breakdown in the social contract that you were describing, and whether, for instance, parents talked about school culture, whether there was a role, or, contributing factors. Maybe they were suggesting that schools that might have a very authoritative or militant stance, for instance, with very strict sanctions over uniform, as an example, or somebody else noting that they work with children with SEN and trauma, and that many don't find school to be a psychologically safe environment to be in. And so the extent to which school systems could focus more on psychological safety for students. And then finally, about the role of motivation to go to school. You were talking about how important that is, but what do we know about the best ways to try and motivate children who might be prone to absence to come to school, and the role potentially of enrichment and play?
So can we, on the sort of first set there, on the sort of social contract with parents, Ed, do you want to respond on that?
Yeah, I mean, the report I wrote with my colleague Sally does explore loads of the issues around the social contract that we've been describing. I think the question about the school culture is really interesting, and actually, it was qual and not quant, and the bits we heard about that didn't amount enough to, a hard conclusion. But I do think there is a sense that, I'll use my words carefully, not least of all because I'm a governor at a school which is pretty strict, the sort of no excuses culture in schools, combined with lots of the other stuff that we've talked about, including cost of living, including COVID, including CAMS, including the complete collapse of CAMS, including SEND, is tricky. And it probably does play, has played some role in the attendance crisis. I would say that I think a lot of the trusts that were known for that are recognising it now, and there is a very substantive move in Matland, as you might call it, to try and rebuild relationships with their communities, and there's a really interesting narrative being driven by the CST about schools as civic anchors and schools as civic institutions. So I don't think it's a huge bit of it. No, I think it's a small contributing factor to a much bigger problem.
Did your research tell you anything about the extent to which parents in particular understand that some of those factors are outside of the control of their schools? I mean, did they have particularly things like the sort of the rationing of SEND support, yeah, and breakdown of CAMS? Some parents maybe think that schools could be doing more to broker that.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think the breakdown in the failure of CAMS and the breakdown in SEND and all the rest are seen as part of a totality which lets down kids who've got profound trauma, partly as a result of COVID. And COVID lockdowns and the mental health pandemic that exacerbated, and I think most parents understand that is outside the control of their schools, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't contribute to their relationship with the school system, right? And the school system is seen as an entity. It's not just the school, but the school system is letting them down and letting their kids down. So. Just because they have a relationship with one school, it doesn't mean so. I think yes and no. So that's not a very good answer.
No, it's sweet. Do you want to add anything to that, Daniela, and also this sort of cluster of points?
Just making it clear that we have a no-nonsense culture at my school, but it's done with love and care, because I think the parents understand that we want your child to be successful in life, and I think that narrative is really clear to all our families, and once that does work for families, it then spreads. So, my reception, I had 200 first applicants for 60 spaces. We often get SEN children naming us on their education and healthcare plan because they know we fight the good fight for them against the local authority and the restrictions. I think lots of parents really struggle with, as I said earlier, coming in the school building, and it's finding that balance and that neutral space where perhaps you can have that conversation, and that why we work with families, particularly, for example, we've had children who have been ill, and I think it's going back to sometimes we have to hold parents to account, but also do it in a way that's respectful and understanding. And finding that balance, I think, is very, very hard, particularly when you have pressures about why is your attendance this percentage, or, you know, why is that child still persistent absentee. You know, I think it does help, you know, onto your point, Anna, about leaders. We're always out there, we're always around, and parents do feel very comfortable to come and talk to us about their difficulties, whatever they are. I'm not saying the school I'm in is a perfect place, but I think, you know, from my own experience in working in a really difficult, I used to work in the White City estate, and there was huge problems with school attendance there. We did the things that were really, you know, to get the children in, such as school, developing a walking bus and all of those things that I know some schools are even in a more difficult situation. But it's about the persistency and the consistency of it. And I've been in, you know, this school now for almost 7 years. So the community knows the expectation, what we will give to you as a family, but you've got to give something back. And I think it's the frankness of the conversations that we have with some of our families about what it means. It's, you know, it's worthwhile.
Thanks.
It's worth its time.
We don't often enough hear the word love in this room, so that's great.
Just a little thing, really, but reminded by Daniel's excellent intervention. One of the things that came across a lot in speaking to parents was that at secondary, especially, to someone else's point earlier, the relationship breaks down often between parents and schools. And when you have a kid who is persistently absent or absent quite a lot, that relationship becomes worse, not better, because the relationship becomes one of tension. Personally, I don't think fines work at all, as far as I can tell. I think they just drive a wedge further between schools and parents in, obviously, normally in very difficult situations. You know, most parents do want their kids to go to school most of the time. But the relationship between the school and the parent is so important. It needs to be personal in that context. It's hard because there's not enough money in the system. I recognise that. But as much as secondary schools, primary schools get this a lot more, but as much as secondary schools can, to understand the context of the kids in question and the parents and their circumstances, and then to give them a single point of contact, having 6-7 different people phone up on 6-7 different days asking the same silly questions just makes the relationship even harder. So that personal relationship, which most importantly is about context, is really, really important.
Right, let's have some more questions from the floor. Ben?
Thanks. Ben Stiles from the National Foundation for Educational Research. So just trying to draw things together a bit. It's clear that a lot of the activity we've heard around ideas that might address this crisis is not the kind of thing that might be picked up in an average Ofsted inspection, and then consequently is not the kind of thing that teachers have been sort of corralled into doing in recent years. Things like belonging and whole school approach to mental health and well-being and all of this sort of thing. So, you know, Lee is often sort of talking about what are the most impactful things to do under a potential new administration, etc. I would think, to me, Ofsted just keeps coming back as being a potential influence on trying to improve the culture in schools, and therefore the ultimate influence on things like attendance. But we are researchers in this room, and Peter asked about data. We're also, some of us are analysts. We don't necessarily blow our own trumpets, but you know, Dave Thompson there, he's done a lot of this. He's looked at attendance modelled attendance rather than attainment. He's looked at inclusivity of schools. He's looked at kind of alternative league tables. You know, we could be looking at preempting the kind of measures that Ofsted, you know, they like measures, they like attainment, they like attainment, EBAC, all of this sort of stuff. We could be looking at what the data can offer us. And yes, Sandra, it is, you know, there are some issues, but, you know, could we be trying to preempt it by looking at alternative metrics that might then drive, improved behaviour?
Thanks, Ben. I mean, you've taken us into an incredibly rich potential area here around the accountability system, and I'm really interested to hear all three of our panelists' views on what you've just said. So I'll start with Daniela.
Well, I think the difficulty with the Ofsted framework is not the actual written framework itself, but it's the interpretation of what that looks like in reality. And it differs from inspector to inspector, and that's very difficult. You know, we use the framework as a guide, and if you look at, you know, the criteria, for me it feels quite clear what schools need to do. That doesn't really answer your question, because I think accountability is very difficult, because the problem is with schools are facing different things, you know, budgetary, region, location, amount of children who speak English as a second language, SEND. How can you possibly quantify all of that into one accountability system? I don't know, is my answer. I don't know how, you know, we could make that better. Yeah.
Yeah, we've long been advocating for the framework to include a wellbeing measure in it that can be reliably picked up on and measured, and I don't think it's an awful lot to ask. There are other bits of missing data too. For example, schools don't have to record bullying as a reason for absence, and we know from our own research that it is a reason for absence. So there's more data that needs to be gathered, and a stronger framework, I would agree.
We do have to share bullying logs with Ofsted, and they would often deep dive into those children. So
but nationally we're not collecting that data, and I think one of the aspects of this is that therefore approaches are often kind of regional, rather than looking at the characteristics of the students that are at least likely to attend, and then applying those measures across. So it's a sort of fairly crude use of the data and use of the framework that is then applied in a sort of one size fits all way.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ofsted is ultimately quite a big driver of this, right? Because it drives all school performance, and you know that's just the way of things. And it's also not going to go away. Ofsted will still be a thing on Friday, right? It's not about to be abolished, and perhaps nor should it be. Obviously, Labour have got this hard policy of replacing the one-word judgment with a balanced scorecard, which I think on paper is a good idea, and I think could catch quite a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. And you know, if it did move schools away from, you know, those harder numbers that we've talked about and move them towards thinking about enrichment and bullying and well-being and absence and all the other things that you might put in a balanced scorecard, this is potentially a good thing, and I am a supporter of it as a policy, not least of all because I think it could have a good result on attendance. But, you know, accountability has a very nasty habit of being the tail that wags the dog, and creating more categories by which we measure schools, not less, could increase the number of perverse incentives in many ways. So my only thought on this is that we should introduce it unbelievably carefully and think extremely hard about it, because the world is littered with examples of balanced scorecards gone wrong.
I think just one last thing. In my experience with attendance and Ofsted, one of the schools I was in when I was a VP, we were below the national average for attendance, and that can obviously make or break a good judgment. But the Ofsted inspector asked me about the leadership of attendance and the trajectory of what our work that we were doing. was having an impact on the pupils and how the data had risen from term to term to term. And we were able to show that, and therefore we were graded good. So I think there is some balance with certain inspectors about their judgments. So just worth sharing that, I think.
Other work we funded has showed issues around consistency of judgment, so that's interesting. I'm going to give one last question. Do a brilliant job on synthesising a question from the...
I think I'll pass and on that synthesis. But the question here is recognising the really important discussions and that are taking place today, but is missing the voices of children and young people. The perspective is that the schools that are making a difference do appear to be prioritising relationships and really trying to understand families. But in this contributors' experience, children and young people don't always, that's not what they hear, or that's not necessarily always children and young people's experience. So they would like to see more research to look at what happens in schools and the impact that has on children and young people's lives, and what is it that means that some children enjoy school and some children don't enjoy school. So just wondering, I guess, whether any reflections on that aspect of things.
Does anyone want to give a quick answer to that?
Yeah, I'm trying to get phase 2 of my attendance project off the ground, and it is exactly that. It's speaking to young people as well as parents and comparing and contrasting. And I've only got 50% of the money, so if anyone wants to give me the other 50%, I'm very much open to it. But I think it's a really important point.
On that point, I mean, I'm going to hand over to Emily to say a last few words. But that was a great discussion with the panel, and thank you so much for keeping the attendance rate up in the room. I'm assuming the attendance rate is also high in the online as well.
Great, thank you. Well, I won't keep you for long. I just wanted to do a couple of things now. First of which is to thank all of our speakers who joined us today. We've honestly just such a huge mind-bending range of aspects of this really important topic that we've heard about today. And really thankful for all your time, both on the research and for explaining it to us today. And obviously to all of the Nuffield staff who've made today possible. I just thought as well it might be useful at this point just to explain obviously what comes next after today. I mentioned that we'll make the recording available, the slides, we'll do a thematic summary of what's come up today, and we'll be sharing that externally, both straight away, but also after things have died down after the election, probably in relation to the publication of further outputs from the studies you've heard about today. But also an important role for us, of course, as a research funder is thinking about what comes next. And I think we've heard quite a lot about that. And we'll be doing some further reflection on what we've heard today about where we think the gaps are and be incorporating that into our ongoing priorities. So, you know, keep an eye on that. I think obviously the top line is that this remains a really important area for the whole education system and taps into so many other aspects of our work. And I just wanted to pick out a handful of things that I think have come through as important themes and gaps where we need to understand more. I'm certainly not comprehensive, but I think we've heard a lot about sort of causes of absence, but I think there's so much more there, really digging beneath the surface to understand both the particular issues for different children and young people and families, what's happening post-COVID, what's happening outside the education system and how that interacts. We've heard a lot about potential solutions, but we know as well that the quality of evidence about the impact of those solutions is still not good enough, not robust enough to really drive a lot of investment. That was touched on by a number of people. So I think there's more that evidence we need there. I think geographic variation, context of place has come up as a theme, both some things we know clearly, some things we don't know about what it is in particular areas. I think the MAT model as well, where you've got schools coordinated often across very different geographic areas, brings an interesting dimension to that, and something which is quite distinct and different from England to, say, Scotland. So I think that's worth looking at. And actually in relation to that, we've heard a little bit about international examples examples and context, but I think there's a lot more, both from a comparative perspective across the UK as well as internationally, that we could learn from. And then something of particular, interest as well is we've looked at long-term outcomes, but I think a lot of the research is very school focused, and I think a next important step is thinking about what's happening in that transition period as the children who've had a bumpy rise in terms of attendance at school are then making transitions post 16 into perhaps different institutions, and what's going on there and how can that transition be supported. So those are just a few reflections from me, but thank you very much. Please, for those in the room, do stay. We've got all manner of drinks and snacks out there, and we're really looking forward to talking further with you. And thank you to the online audience for joining us as well and for all of your questions.